Okay, I'm going to call the Governance Committee to order. The first order of business is roll call.
Priya Mather.
Here.
Dana Hollinger.
Here.
Margaret Brown.
Here.
Steve Juarez for John Chung.
Here.
Rob Beckner. Ramon Rubalcava.
Here.
Teresa Taylor.
Okay, we have a quorum. Please also note for the record that Mr. Jones, Ms. Paquin, Mr. Slayton, and Mr. Brown are all in attendance as well. Oh, I'm sorry, and Mr. Miller are all in attendance as well. Next item on the agenda is the executive report. Mr. Jacobs.
Good afternoon, Chair Mather and committee members. I'd like to start with an update on the report on timely compliance with Form 700 filings. CalPERS had a 99.1% timely completion rate for the 2017 annual Form 700 filings that were due on April 2nd. There were quite a large number of folks who had to file. There were 1,047 board members, employees, and consultants who were scheduled to file. Within the board and employee population, there were 8 outstanding filers who were either on a leave of absence or had left the agency. So what that means is that all active employees filed and board members filed on time. Within the consultant population, 1 consultant did file late, bringing the consultant percentage to 100% complete. So that is the report on Form 700. Beyond that, Chair Mather, I think we can just proceed to the agenda.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the action consent items. Before I ask for a motion, we do have some members of the public who wish to speak on agenda items 3B and 3C, so I'll ask those members of the public to come forward now. On 3B, Kathy Jeppesen and George Lynn. If you would please come forward and take your seat. I'm going to allow 4 minutes for each of you on this item.
Sorry, I'm so slow.
No, that's quite all right. Ms. Jeppesen, if you want to start.
Sorry, I was waiting for George.
That's quite all right. Thank you. And then we'll turn to George.
Good afternoon. Mine will not take 4 minutes. My name is Kathy Jeppesen. I'm from California Teachers Association and California Faculty Association. And I only wanted to make a comment on, I know I don't have the same pages that you do, but on attachment 1 of consent action item 3B, on page 13, number 5C, as well as on page 14, number 3B. I understand that in theory we need to take, because the meetings are running, sometimes the meetings run late into the evening, but I don't think that the ability to, I don't really understand why you would need approval if it's an estimated time. I certainly don't agree with everything else there, restating the motion and the order that you want to have board members speak, but I don't think in theory it's going to work with setting time, because the perception of that, I think, from stakeholders is that it's eliminating conversation between the board members. And I think that when tomorrow comes and there is a discussion on finance and administration about the results of the stakeholder survey, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I think you're going to be shocked by what the perception of the stakeholders are with regards to CalPERS. And that's the only reason that I am bringing this up, that it's a good idea, but I don't think that it's going to work in actuality.
Thanks so much, Ms. Jefferson. Mr. Lynn.
Yes, my name is George Lynn. I'm president of the Retired Public Employees Association of California. Chairman Maher and committee members and other board members. I'm a little bit of a parrot here from what my friend Kathy has said. One of my concerns is, and having sat on a number of boards, including national boards, the interaction between board members is sometimes the most critical thing that can happen. Staff can stand on their head, they can talk for hours, but it's the interaction between board members that really brings things to a focus. So anytime that you're trying to limit things, I have a problem with this because we need to make certain that every board member has an opportunity to vet their questions and even listen to those members of the board that are not part of the committee, because they may have insightful information that may or may not be something that the board members of the committee will be voting on. And I think that it is not in the best interests of good business, frankly. So that's one topic I wanted to talk on. The other topic I want to talk on, because these are both items in the same agenda item, and thank you for the extra time, Chairman Mather. I'm concerned that we're diluting the power of the board when we strike out and give sole responsibility and sole authority to the CEO for the hiring of the CIO. In my opinion, and you know, I think Marcy's fine, but what is the goal here of CalPERS? Well, the CalPERS goal, I always thought, would be return on investment so that the pensions can be paid to those members that have been working to get those pensions. So we're talking about, in my opinion, maybe the most important person in the organization. Yes, the CEO has good authority, but I think the CIO is one that has to interact very closely with the board, and so the board, I think, in my opinion, should have a very integral part in selecting and working with that individual. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is an action item, 3A, B, and C. What's the pleasure of the committee? Moved by Ms. Taylor. Is there a second to the motion? Seconded by Mr. Fechner. Any discussion on the motion?
Can we separate them out? Is A, B, and C all together?
It has been moved. If you could use your mic, please. Thank you. Your question, Ms. Brown?
So are we acting on all three at once?
On 3A, which is the approval of the March meeting minutes, 3B, which is the approval of the revisions to the board governance policy, and 3C, approval of revisions to the board governance policy with respect to the views expressed disclaimer.
I'd like to pull 3B so I can vote on it separately, or just vote no on that item.
Okay, we will take up 3B separately.
Thank you.
So on the motion for 3A and 3C, any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Someone has a comment.
Motion passes.
Does he have a comment? Neil?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Johnson, forgive me. Thank you. I'm sorry. I had it underneath my notebook. Mr. Johnson on 3C. Thank you. No, that's all right.
Good afternoon. My name is Neil Johnson. I represent Service Employees International Local 1000. And I'm speaking on 3C. I agree with the concept, but I think there was a drafting error in on what shows as mine on page 21 of 35. under M, because what it says now is that if you speak, you give the statement. Part of that statement says, those views do not reflect PERS. And I think you really want a qualifier such as necessarily, because they may, Ms. Mother may get asked a question that's so factual that nobody would inherently say, like it's today's Monday. But you would have to say, no, it is not Monday, or it didn't happen.
Fair
so
enough.
I think there's it was a drafting error, and I would suggest adding a word like such as necessarily or some similar word.
Thank you
And
for
with
your
that,
comment, Mr.
We're supportive.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jacobs, would that is?
I think
do you
that's
have any
fine.
concern?
I think that's a good idea.
I would agree with that. So we already took a vote. Can I just direct that change be made?
Yes.
I think that's acceptable to the rest of the committee.
Yes, and we'll just
Just add the word necessarily.
add the word necessarily and upload the new
Terrific.
board governance policy with that change.
Great,
Very
thank
good.
you. So the motion did pass on 3A and 3C, and I've now directed that we add the word necessarily before the word reflect. Then now on 3B, Ms. Taylor, did you want to, I guess we just split it, so it's still made. Okay, so on 3B, is there discussion on the motion? Ms. Brown.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments from members in the audience. I'm wondering if we actually wouldn't have had more public comment if we didn't have a lengthy closed session before board governance. So I don't know how the scheduling necessarily works, but it'd be nice to not have a 4-hour closed session and an open session at the end of the evening. I think for accountability and transparency, we should try to work on that scheduling, Ms. Frost, if we could do that in the future. But on the actual point of the item, I do agree that there are some concerns about making sure that everybody does have an opportunity to speak, and so I'm going to be voting no on the motion.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair. Just, I'm going to be voting yes on this. I will note that we were 20 minutes behind is all. We were scheduled for 3 o'clock, so we actually were running ahead earlier. But I will say that I'm on a bunch of boards myself, and most of those boards run very close to Robert's Rules of Order, which is chair can cut off debate. Actually, anyone can call the question. So at any time, I mean, if we were really running on Robert's Rules of Order, anyone can call the question. These are really very around the edges type of let's try to do this. And I think in the spirit of the way it reads, I think that it's basically maintaining the ability for all board members to be able to speak. It's just that we're going to address, and I've forgotten to do it myself sometimes as a chairman of a committee, we're going to address the people on the committee first and then the board members that want to speak. It's not saying we're not going to let board members speak. So I want to make that clear. So again, I'm going to be voting yes on this. And again, on many of the boards I'm on, there's much more stringent time-based Robert's Rules of Order. We're very liberal in the way we handle our board meetings here.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Mr. Slayton, on the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On C, could I ask for council's interpretation of what C actually means? What would occur?
You can, but C.
So we already approved. We already approved C. We are on.
No.
D.
I'm sorry. I'm talking about D3C. Pardon me.
Can you give a page number, please?
Did we already approve 14 to 25?
What?
This is attachment 1 of 3. Are we doing B right now?
We're doing 3B.
3B. Okay, so 3B, attachment 1, page 14 to 25.
Page 14.
3B,
And-
attachment 1.
And so number C is securing approval of estimated times?
That's the one.
That one?
That's the one I'm asking the interpretation for.
My
What does that
interpretation
mean?
of that, Mr. Slayton, is that at the beginning of each meeting, there would be an estimate attached to each agenda item, and the chair of that committee would ask for a vote or for comment or for changing it or whatever, but by the end of the discussion on approving the timed agenda, the committee would vote that this is our timed agenda.
Okay, so it's basically the committee approving this sheet?
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, yes.
Okay,
correct.
or changing it?
Yes.
Right, okay. So,
Keeping in mind that the committee can always make changes to the time, and the chair
Right.
can always make changes to the amount of time for any particular item.
I understand. Does that denote that this is also made available to the public? Is this
Yes.
timesheet?
It's not made available,
Right.
but it would be
It would be
made public.
because of this language in C? Or is there some other?
Yes, because it would be adopted by the committees at the start of the committee
So-
meeting.
so because it's on the
It's part of the
agenda.
committee materials.
So it'd be on the agenda, so it'd be
Exactly.
out there, great.
Right.
Because that's, the main part of this, I think, is, and to address the comments other people made, is that this is not about limiting conversation, unless we as a group decide to cut off discussion. It's just it's information. So it lets everybody know, and the audience know, everybody knows. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer now, given your interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, the time that is estimated on this document, I'm wondering what's the value of adopting it? Because the chair and the appropriate senior staff, you know, they talk about estimated time, and I think it would be disingenuous for someone who hadn't had that discussion with the staff about how much time we're to come and then make changes to the time. So I would just say leave it like this without an adoption, because the chair has worked with the staff for these estimated times anyway.
I think the point of adopting it is that the whole committee acknowledges that this is the time that we are shooting for, so that we can be efficient in our conversation. Not eliminate discussion or squash discussion anyway, but to be cognizant of the time estimate in the comments that we make, so that we run the committees more efficiently. So it's really acknowledging on the part of the committee members that they understand, that they acknowledge that these are the time limits that we're not limited to, but that we are that we're shooting for.
Yeah, they're estimates.
They're estimates.
Yeah.
Your microphone, okay.
Yeah. If I'm on the committee and these estimated times are here, for example, normally it's not an issue with action consent and information consent. It's only when you get to the either action items or the information item. If a board member has a question on this and we have gone 30 minutes, for example, on item 6, I think that board member has a right to be heard.
Sure. It's not that the board member won't be heard. It's that perhaps the chair would say, okay, that we had estimated 20 minutes for this item. We're now at 20 minutes. Would the committee like to continue the conversation? How many? You could have the conversation. Should we extend the time 5 more minutes? Would that satisfy, or are we ready to close debate and make a motion? Or so it prompts the committee to be aware of the time, not necessarily to cut off debate, but to make affirmative, thoughtful decisions about how long to spend on each agenda item. Mr. Slayton.
So let me make a suggestion, because it seems to me we're blending 2 separate things. One is, by having this language in here, this becomes part of the public record, and everybody who's attending the meeting gets to see it. Whereas today, that does not occur. And I think that's a helpful piece of information for everyone to have of, here's the plan. But the plan was determined by the chair, the vice chair, working with staff to determine the times associated with the committee. I'm not sure I see, I think this really goes to the chair managing the meeting. Mm-hmm. Since everyone who's on the committee and on the board, and then if we modify this slightly, doesn't have to be a vote, it can just be part of the record and passed out, that everyone has this. So now the responsibility is for the committee chair to manage according to this. And to say, we've gone 20 minutes and we allocated 10, do people want to continue the conversation? So I don't think that that we require this language or an affirmation at the start to be able to have the chair have the authority to manage the meeting to the schedule. So I would suggest to the committee that you just make the agenda, timed agenda, part of the record, and that covers the issue, in my opinion.
Mr. Miller.
I just had a question for the general counsel. It seems like this language would not allow any of the committee chairs discretion to manage their committee without going through this formal process. Would that be correct?
I don't think so. I think the idea would be you get a general concurrence of a committee at the outset of a meeting, but it would remain within the chair's discretion as to how to manage the time.
Yeah, but the committee chair would have to come to that committee meeting prepared with a timed agenda and would have to put it before the members of the committee and get their concurrence?
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Jones? Or were you not?
No.
Okay. Ms. Brown?
So I'll propose an alternate motion approving of agenda item 3B and striking number 5C on page 15, and I think on page, is it on page 14 as well?
Yeah, DC. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that as well.
Sorry, it dies for lack of a second. Mr. Juarez?
I'm going to move the item as it's been proposed in the staff agenda, but that hasn't been done already.
Thank you, Mr. Juarez. There is already a motion on the floor.
Okay, sorry about that.
But I appreciate that.
No.
And I have no further requests to speak. So on the motion, which is to approve 3B as it was originally drafted, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No.
Please record Mr. Miller's and Ms. Brown's noes. Thank you very much. Motion passes. That brings us to agenda item 4. I've had no requests to pull anything off of 4. So that will bring us to agenda item 5, the annual review of the CEO delegation resolution. Actually, Mr. Miller's not on the committee, so he did not vote in the last vote.
Thank you for your
That's what caught me.
It's
what caught me.
confusing having done that way. Thank you.
Okay. very
Mr.
good.
Jacobs.
Yes. I'm going to pass this one to Marlene Timberlake Diadamo.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee and board. Marlene Timberlake Diadamo, CalPERS team member. This agenda item is the annual review of the Chief Executive Officer Delegation Resolution. Each year at this time, CalPERS' board approves each of the committee and the CEO delegation. Since the final committee delegations were approved at last month's board meetings, this month you have the CEO delegation, which has been modified to incorporate any changes that have occurred through the affirmation of the committee delegations and other ministerial changes we've accumulated through the course of the year. Specific modifications to this delegation include clarity to the role and authority of the CEO and alignment with the Performance, Compensation, and Talent Management Committee delegation resolution that was approved on April 18, 2018. Additional modifications specify that the board's outside independent counsel for administrative appeals and the board's self-assessment consultant are procurements the board has reserved the authority to approve consistent with the board governance policy and the board procurement policies. This concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Mr. Slayton, one moment. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's not a question, but it's a suggestion to the committee that you entertain making one modification as chair of the Performance and Comp Committee. I think that I would refer everybody to item 9, which is page 2 of the delegation, page 2 of 4. And it's the one that starts out, set the compensation of employees listed in Government Code Section 20098 and those in career executive assignments consistent with the board's established compensation policies and procedure. And the change I would ask the committee to consider is the next sentence. The board retains the authority for setting the compensation structure and performance goals for the CEO.
I think it was the prior sentence that you wanted to amend.
Yeah, correct. Well, it's the board retains the authority for setting the compensation structure and performance goals for the CEO. I don't have any problem with that. That's okay. But I think that the compensation for 20098 and for executive positions, that we should be, the board should be only reserving the right to set the ranges, the compensation range, rather than the whole what's variable pay and what's base pay. And I'm not sure the right wording in this to accomplish that, but that's what I'm trying to get to, that we delegate to the CEO that authority to hire and fire people in those categories. And I think that we should step away from setting what the compensation package should be, with the exception of meeting our fiduciary duty. And our fiduciary duty is to make sure that we set a cap to the total compensation. So that's what I'm trying to get to, is for us, for this board to be responsible for setting what the total compensation is and having the CEO actually determine the base versus variable, and for us to hold her accountable for that to be accomplished.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. Mr. Fechner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have concerns on item 8, the taking out the responsibility or shared responsibility for the hiring and terminating of the CIO. This was a lengthy discussion we had that arrived at a compromise. This was our compromise decision, and now we're taking it out. And I just have a very strong feeling about that, that we discussed this for a great period of time and come up with this as a compromise that we would have a shared responsibility. And to just take it out now, I think, is a misstep.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Juarez.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on 9. So where it says consistent with the board established compensation policies and procedures, I'm assuming that's where, going to Mr. Slayton's point of view, or point, where we would have whatever the rules are there, that's what you're concerned about, that we're not overreaching with regard to our own procedures and policies. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think we could leave this alone and worry about what we have in policies and procedures as it relates to compensation. So that's where you want to, I think you'd want to be certain that we're not getting in too deep in terms of doing anything other than the ranges. But I think we could leave this alone, and that's my perspective on it.
Okay. Thank you. So that's to leave. When you say leave it alone, you mean
leave it as it's been proposed.
As the proposal.
As it's been proposed.
Yeah.
Can I just go ahead and, now that I still have the floor?
Yes, please.
I would demur from Mr. Fechner's point of view. I just feel it's very important that the CEO have responsibility directly to manage and both the hiring and the affairs of the CIO in any organization. And it's something that I know has been, as Mr. Fechner said, probably discussed a lot, but I just, coming to this and having seen it work in other organizations, I just feel very strongly that the CEO should have that authority and responsibility, and that's would be the way I view it.
Thank you, Mr. Juarez. Ms. Brown.
Thank you. I was wondering if I could ask a question of Mr. Fechner. Are you suggesting on page 204, number 8, that you strike all the red and put it all back in?
If I may, I think what he was suggesting is that the board, that retaining the language, the board and the CEO share responsibility for hiring, evaluating, et cetera, and terminating the CIO, period. Is that right, Mr. Fechner? So just that, the first redlined sentence.
If you were to make an alternate motion, I would support that.
Okay. Mr. Rubalcava.
Thank you. I think number 9 has been addressed, because I think if you read the previous section, this all applies to the CAO, so I think we're okay. On number 8, I just had a question. I'm okay with this one, but is it I'm new. Does the board have a role in the I would say, not selection process, but maybe selection. Is there like, what role does the board play in the CEOs, in the search for the CIO? Is there some input, I guess?
Ms. Frost, perhaps maybe you should come up. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. So with the announcement that was made this morning, my plan would be to begin recruitment for the CIO replacement. I would invite members of the investment committee, likely the chair and vice chair perhaps of the committee, but that could be determined by the committee itself, to participate in the selection process of the new CIO.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay, great. Mr. Fechner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I expressed already my concerns about this, and I appreciate Ms. Frost's point, but putting this in place is not for Ms. Frost, it's for the CEO. So if there's a different CEO, they don't have to have that perception. And I think that handcuffs us to some point, and this was put in as a safeguard during our discussion. So I would like to add back in the first red line sentence there.
Is that a motion, Mr. Fechner?
It is a motion, please.
I'll second that.
Motion made by Fechner, seconded by Brown. We have a public comment request for this one? Okay, thank you. On the motion, Mr. Slayton?
Thank you. And by the way, I'm fine with number 9, and we can take care of it in performance and comp. I think this would be a big mistake to do this. I think that we have moved to the CIO being a direct report to the CEO. And I think that was a very excellent change that we made. That change allows the CEO to be a true CEO. And I think that this organization is well served by that structure. I think this moves us back toward a kind of a quasi-CEO when it comes to this particular position. I think for Mr. Fechner's concern about a safeguard, the best safeguard we have is having a good CEO. And when we go to interview the next CEO, part of the interview process will be us being comfortable that, in fact, we have someone that we can trust to work with us on and involve us in hiring a critical position. But I think the authority for it organizationally should vest with the CEO. Otherwise, the CEO is really a COO, and we're sort of acting as the CEO in this particular situation. And I don't think we're well served from a governance standpoint by being reserving that ability to be a decider on the CIO. I think the CEO who serves at the pleasure of this board certainly is going to take into account our reaction and our judgment when it comes to filling such a critical position. And if the CEO does not do that, then they're not the right person to be in that position.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. We have no further requests from the committee or the board. We do have a request from the public to speak on this item. Mr. Darby, would you please make your way down?
If I may, while Mr. Darby is making his way down, I would just point out that the PCTM, Performance Comp and Talent Management Committee, did strike this very language from its delegation a couple of months ago, and then that was adopted by the full board last month.
That's an important point, because we would want to be consistent between the two delegations.
Correct.
So what happens if two committees pass different conflicting language? Sorry, Mr. Darby, we'll get to you in one moment.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that what we would have to do is come back around and make it consistent at a later date. But it has been full board approved as of right now. So I guess we would see what the board did on Wednesday and figure it out then.
Okay. On the item, Mr. Darby, if you could identify yourself and your affiliation for the record, you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Madam Chair, board members, Al Darby, Retired Public Employees Association Vice President. I believe that Mr. Fechner's amendment is in accordance with our view of this situation. I believe that amendment was to reserve the right of the board to participate in the selection of the CIO. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. We agree with that position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darby. Seeing no further requests to speak, the motion is before the committee to adopt the CEO delegation resolution as it is drafted, with the one exception of reinstating on page 2 of 4 under item 8, the first struck sentence. Is that clear as mud to everyone? I think so. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
The two ayes that I heard were Brown and Fechner. All opposed, say no.
No.
So the motion fails. So we still need a motion on this item. Okay, it was, thank you. Ms. Taylor moved the original motion, the original recommendation, and it was seconded by Mr. Rubalcava. Mr. Juarez, did you wish to speak on the item? Sorry.
I'm going to vote for the motion, but I'm sensitive to Mr. Fechner's point about participating in the selection, just being involved, and obviously he makes a good point in saying, well, that may be Marcy's point of view, but it may not be a future CEO's point of view. I would, we could add language to that effect, but I would just say that we should have an understanding, or you should all have an understanding as we go forward, that it's a good idea to, on key decisions like CIOs positions and maybe a couple of the others involving the board, I think is instrumental. And I know that it won't be guaranteed once we get a new CEO that that's going to be the case, but it should be the culture of the board that that's the case.
And certainly I imagine the board will not be silent if they're unhappy
I would hope so.
with the process.
In any case, I just wanted to recognize that I think the point is well made, but I'm very comfortable with the language.
Thank you, Mr. Juarez. So on the motion, which is to adopt the original staff recommendation regarding the CEO delegation resolution, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
Please note Mr. Fechner and Ms. Brown's noes. Motion passes. Okay, that brings us to the information items. Agenda item number 6, other government agencies' processes for handling harassment allegations against board members. Mr. Jacobs.
Yes, thank you, Chair Mather. This agenda item presents the question of whether the board should pursue a procedure like the one laid out by the UC regents in the attachment to the agenda item for handling harassment allegations against board members. The question to the committee is what it thinks about this particular policy. As stated in the agenda item, we didn't find any others of statewide agencies. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but we didn't find them. And so that's really something that the committee can discuss, whether this is something that the board should adopt for itself. I will note that there's one constraint on the wholesale adoption of the regent's policy, were that the committee's and ultimately the board's inclination, which is that the UC policy appoints the general counsel to investigate allegations and then consult with a 3-member panel. Under Bagley-Keene, 3 members would be too many, and such an advisory panel could only have 2 members unless it wanted to meet in open session, which I don't believe is the intent of the UC policy. So I don't know what rules UC is operating under, but that wouldn't quite work for us.
Okay, thank you. This is an information item for discussion by the committee. What is the pleasure of the committee? Oh, Ms. Taylor.
So I still think that we should have a policy. I'm understanding, Mr. Jacobs, you to say that UC didn't have a policy right now. Is that correct, that I'm
No,
understanding?
if you look at attachment 1, there is a policy that talks about allegations, violations of ethical principles.
No, UC has a very well-developed policy.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I guess our question then is, can we adopt a similar policy like this? And I did read it earlier, I just don't, I was hearing something completely different, I'm sorry. Because it is still the state of California. And I think what our questions were before were, can we have these values and this policy without violating anything? And it sounds like that there are some things that we can do.
I think the only exception that was identified by Mr. Jacobs is that we would have to have a 2-member panel, and perhaps that would be the chair and vice chair of the governance committee, or we could determine, or the board president and vice president might be 2 options. And that's the only change that would need to be made for us to adopt a similar policy.
Correct.
And we don't have to have any kind of written law or anything like that for us to have these kind of like sanctions that I'm reading about here.
No, these sanctions, I will note, do not include the termination of a board member.
Right.
These sanctions are all similar to the ones that currently exist in the board governance policy. But to answer your question more directly, no, there's no law that would stand in the way of the adoption of this type of policy. I mean, there'd be some wording changes to be sure, but other than what the Bagley-Keene point that I raised, you could adopt it.
Okay. I don't know if everybody agrees, but I think that we could move forward with this.
Well, unless there's any opposition to that, I would direct the team to bring back a policy largely similar to this, but of course taking into account any Bagley-Keene considerations for adoption by this committee and the board.
Great, happy to.
Ms. Brown.
Yeah, so I'm actually just sort of reading through this. I'd like to hear what maybe somebody from the university says, if they think this policy works for them, works well for them. Have they had to use it with any of their regents to date? So it'd be kind of nice to know if it works, or is this just something they have in their policy and they really don't. It's not a go-to document. It's also kind of interesting on page 5 of 5, number 3. It says the board may revoke a regent's university privilege, such as access to university property, use of administrative staff, or parking and library privilege. So I just want to make sure this all, if we were going to adopt this, that we relook at that and make sure that this this works constitutionally for those of us who are elected members.
I think that's fair to, when you bring something back, to just ensure that those things are all consistent.
Yes, I would note that it was only adopted last year, so I don't know that UC has a lot of experience under that, but we can certainly check.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Juarez.
Yeah, I was going to go down that same road of suggesting that we at least check in with the general counsel at the Office of the President of the university. And it's interesting, again, I don't know Bagley-Keene that well, and if it suggests that you can't do 3-member boards, the predicament or dilemma you have is that, let's say you have 2-member board and they don't agree. At least this policy allowed for when 2 of the 3 members have a decided point of view, that's what carries the day. If you have 2 members and they're not in accord, there's going to be a stalemate. Not that that's the worst thing in the world, but that clearly is not what would be intended by the resolution. So I would just, I'd be curious, again, I'm not challenging you on this, Mr. Jacobs, but why we could not have a 3-member advisory board. Is that strictly written in Bagley-Keene? Expressly?
I'm going to ask my colleague, Robert Carlin, to come up and address that question.
This is in public. That would be in private.
Robert Carlin from the CalPERS Legal Office. Mr. Juarez, it is clear in the statute that once you get to 3 members, you're now a body that's subject to all the requirements of Bagley-Keene, including having to meet an open session. So it's only a body less than 3 members that's acting in an advisory capacity that doesn't have to comply with all those requirements.
And none of the prerequisites for a closed meeting would apply to this situation where you're potentially reprimanding a member of the board?
Not in the context of a board member. The exceptions for the personnel exception applies to employees of the agency, but doesn't cover the members of the board themselves. So that's why there's a problem if we get beyond 2.
Yeah. As far as I know, UC operates according to Bagley-Keene.
And UC may very well have some other statutory authorization. I know UC has got kind of special privileges under the California Constitution, independence, and
but I don't think it's exempt from Bagley-Keene. So, but it's worth checking anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So the direction has been given. I think it was clear.
Very good.
So seeing no further discussion, let's move on to agenda item number 7, the process for reviewing closed session and other confidential materials. Mr. Jacobs.
Yes. Yes, this item calls on the committee to consider whether to recommend to the board essentially to ratify the current policy of requiring members to review confidential materials such as the minutes of closed or the transcripts of closed session meetings at CalPERS' headquarters here in Sacramento. I think the written agenda item frames the issue well. The CalPERS team, as noted in the agenda item, agrees with the policy because we think it helps minimize even inadvertent leaks, which can completely undermine the work that CalPERS, both staff and board, is doing and the decisions that we are making. And as you debate or consider and discuss this agenda item, I would just suggest that you consider a simple scenario in which a board member, and this gets to the kind of the inadvertent part, misplaces his or her CalPERS' iPad over the weekend that has these transcripts or other confidential information on it. So there's the intentional problem, but I don't think that ought necessarily to be what's focused upon, although it's important, but really the inadvertent is also something, the inadvertent disclosure of these types of materials is something that needs to be considered in our opinion.
Thank you. Discussion by the committee. Mr. Slayton?
Thank you. Does that mean I'm ahead of the rest of the...
That means you're the only one who pushed your button.
Okay. Yeah. Just make sure we're following our new process, I guess, until tomorrow at least. So I think the inadvertent thing is really, I think that's the important consideration. And I understand that, and therefore I have no problem with having to come from Carmichael to downtown if I want to review transcripts. The challenge comes for those who do not live in Sacramento. But we happen to have something called regional offices. So I would suggest that we can, if it's not an administrative burden, to create some process so that if a member does not reside in Sacramento, that they in fact could do the same review in a CalPERS regional office. And maybe that solves the access where every board member has comparable access to the written material. So that's just a suggestion to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. Ms. Brown.
Well, Mr. Slayton, that's an awesome idea. I don't know what staff thinks of that. I'd like to hear what they think of that, but I could certainly make it to the Orange office much easier than I can to the Sacramento office to review transcripts. So is it possible to get a confidential computer at the regional offices in Glendale or wherever you'd go, Mr. Jones? Where would you go to review those?
That's too far. Well, might be easier to get to Sacramento.
Ms. Frost, do you want to address that?
We could certainly look at the regional locations and their capacity to have, a confidential area set up where the board could review closed session transcripts. There may be some offices that would have a better setup logistically to be able to do that, but we could certainly take a look at it.
Okay. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, so if you're talking about setting up a confidential, why not set up a confidential computer in my house?
Yeah, I think the question is if somebody broke into your house and took your computer, then that would be, it wouldn't be through any fault of your own, but there is still an opportunity, or if it's a laptop, it could be taken out of your house. Anyway,
I was just going to add, I think the one additional safeguard you would have by having it in a regional location is that it's on the CalPERS network still. So that would be an additional safeguard.
I understand the need to address leaks and information being shared when it shouldn't be, but I think we need to focus on the problem. Find out who's leaking and have consequences for leaking information, because what happens, we don't deal with the cause and we just penalize everybody. And, I just think we need to change our focus and let's find a way to deal with these leaked pieces of information and deal with them accordingly.
I think I don't know, Ms. Frost, if you want to address that, but I think part of the concern is that in this digital age, it's so easy for information to be inadvertently disclosed that it's meant to be kept confidential. It's not that anyone is deliberately doing anything. It's really that we want to protect, given the risks that are currently at play, and that we want to protect the system and our members. I think that's really what it's about. I don't know, Mr. Jacobs, Ms. Frost, if you want to add anything to that.
I was going to concur with your statements. I think it's more of concern. I think I've spoken with you about this. I came out of a system where we actually had a data leakage issue that arose, and it was related to an inadvertent loss of a laptop that was filled with actuarial data. It was done by our external actuarial auditor. And so my sensitivities around data management are probably honed from that time frame. It was a very stressful period of time where we did not know where that data had landed, if you will. So I think the regional location is certainly another option. It doesn't sound like that's much of a viable option for you, Mr. Jones. But we're happy to continue looking. But this is really around data management. It's around protection of really important data that we talk about here in Sacramento. It's not necessarily around leaks. You're right, we have had leaks in the past, but that is not the reason for this policy, the consideration of this policy today. It could be a consideration for individual committee members or board members to be worried about leaks. But I think this is really more about what is the effective data management policies, data governance policies for a board and an entity like CalPERS, with the significance of the work that we all do together.
And the sensitivity of the information with which we're entrusted. Okay, Mr. Miller.
I don't know if this is a potential solution for the future. We've got this to deal with today, but having secure read-only access to specific files for specific people set up based on their needs might be a possibility. I work in a regulatory law enforcement agency, and there are some things that I can access from home. There are other things I can access only at work, but when I need to work on something that's specific, they can usually set me up. But it never comes into my hard drive. It's read-only. I can't print it. I can't. Now, maybe some brilliant hacker could, but just a possibility to explore.
Okay. I think there's a desire to explore this further, perhaps explore the regional offices, maybe some other ideas. I haven't heard I haven't heard much else than that. We do have a member of the public who wishes to speak on this item. Sure. So did you want to say anything before?
I was just going to make one point. There was no data loss as a result of the example that I just gave. I want to be really clear about that.
Thank you.
But it would still raise the sensitivities around this issue.
Fair enough. Mr. Perez, please come down, take a seat. The mics are on. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. Please identify yourself and your affiliation for the record.
Thank you. My name is Jason Perez. I'm the president of the Corona Police Officers Association. In regards to this specific agenda item, I think a simple solution, and I know your IT team members are squared away, so I think a simple solution is a VPN with two-factor authentication. You have a little thing on your phone. You have to enter the code, and then Mr. Jones, Ms. Hollinger, Ms. Brown, folks that live far away, you can VPN into your computer here, read everything you want from the comfort of your recliner. And it's very secure.
Well, thank you for that suggestion. We will also include that in the further work that we will do, and we'll bring it back to another future.
Yeah, I would just comment, it's not foolproof because there is also the possibility of screenshots from people's, from whatever, cameras, intruders' cameras, whatever. So
yes.
I just want to point that out.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, that was just an information item, so we will move on to agenda item 8, the process for handling mail directed to board members. Mr. Jacobs. Your microphone is on.
Happily pass this on to Ms. Falzerano.
Ms. Falzerano.
All right. Good afternoon, members of the committee. Jan Falzerano, CalPERS team member. So this is an information item in response to the board's requests for additional information on the process for handling correspondence addressed to the Board of Administration and/or to individual board members. In your agenda item packet, there are 2 process maps for today's discussion. The first map, marked option A, aligns with the current process that we practice today. The only change is that the CEO will review and approve the approaches for responding to stakeholder correspondence rather than the board president. The second map, which is marked option B, has a similar intake process to option A. However, all the correspondence addressed to a specific board member will be forwarded unopened directly to that board member. So I'll start by just walking you through option A, and then we'll go on to option B. So in general, CalPERS mailroom does not open any correspondence that is addressed specifically to a named board member or board members. These are forwarded to the board services unit for review and for dissemination. If any of the correspondence is marked confidential, the board unit will not open the correspondence and it will be forwarded or mailed directly to that board member. If a correspondence is addressed to a general group, often it will just say the CalPERS Board of Administration, or maybe it'll address a specific committee, the mailroom will open the correspondence and ensure that it's routed appropriately to the program areas. So often, these correspondence will include benefit forms. So they may have retirement application, health election forms, or just requesting any kind of general assistance from CalPERS. So we would route those directly to the appropriate program areas, which will reduce the response time and increase the customer service level for our members. Correspondence that does request the board's assistance will go directly to the board unit for review, as they can identify where the issue is currently being worked on, because sometimes a member can make the same letters to multiple board members, and also help coordinate a response with the program area. So this prevents the duplication of efforts, it ensures stakeholders receive a timely and consistent response, and also protects the confidential data, because often members will also send in their medical data or information that may have their Social Security numbers listed on them. So currently the process for responding to stakeholder is reviewed and approved by the board president, and under option A, this responsibility is reflected as the CEO. So as stated earlier, option A does align with the current process that we practice today. So any questions before I move forward to option B?
I don't see any at this time.
Okay. So under option B, the board unit team will mail all correspondences directly to the board member. Since option B does require the board unit team to forward the correspondence, which may include any members or stakeholder inquiries, it may require an additional step to log the correspondence forwarded to the board member in the event members or employers or the stakeholders call to inquire about the status of their inquiry. This process may also require notification to the call center to forward the calls to the board unit team to research if the correspondence has been forwarded to the individual board members. If members are to forward their information to the individual board members, there are some responsibilities that must be considered. So each board member will be responsible for properly securing the confidential correspondence and any attachment that may contain personal health information or the personal identifiable information, so both the PHI and the PII data. So if it does require for you to send the information back to us to help the individual, it will require scanning and encrypting those documents before you email them back to CalPERS so that we can respond to the member, as well as returning the documents to CalPERS for proper destruction. Board members can opt to mail the confidential documents back to CalPERS in lieu of emailing them. However, this approach could result in longer response time for our members. The correspondence may also be potentially subject to the California Public Records Act requests, and board members could be required to search their correspondence in order to comply with the PRA requests. As a best practice for ensuring compliance, it would be beneficial if board members track and log the business-related correspondence. When documents are mailed back to CalPERS for response, the board unit at that time will review and log the correspondence as they do in option A to prevent that duplication and ensure that stakeholders receive a consistent response. And this process is also followed under option A. However, there would be delayed responses under option B due to additional time to forward and return the mail. And similar to option A, the next steps will include the CEO or the board president approving the approach for response, and the board unit team will work with the program areas to respond to the stakeholder inquiries and notify the appropriate board members with the final response. So this concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. From the committee, Mr. Juarez.
Yeah, I guess I just want to ask the question what our assumption is about when someone addresses a letter to an individual board member. Do we assume that it's intended for that board member?
In my program experience, what I've experienced is that they want to have an escalation issue that gets handled immediately. And so if it's addressed to a board member, usually it's forwarded to the program area, and we would have to respond to the member, and we would have to CC the board. And so usually we would respond sometimes quicker when it's addressed to a board member for us to handle.
I guess I'm just having trouble with your answer. Only in that, why would they send me a letter asking for an issue to be resolved by the system?
It depends on what the question is, and it varies. It could be that they disagree with the decision. So in my prior days working in the disability retirement, we may deny a disability retirement, but they would write to a board member asking for help because they disagree with the decision that program staff has made. And so in that instance, we would work with the program area as well to look at the case, to make those determinations, and we will respond back to that individual member. But it could be various reasons. Sometimes they just don't know who to address it to, so they do address it to a board member.
Or it could be that they want a response from that board member.
It could be that they could want a response from that board member.
And that's really, the decision here is where do you err? And so, again, I don't feel that strongly about it, but I just figure if somebody's sending me a letter here for some reason, that I should get that letter first. And if I feel it's better served to have the system respond, then I'll send it back to the system, and I don't mind logging it. I realize the bureaucratic delay that may occur, but it's just interesting to me that something that would be addressed on a personal level would be opened and dealt with, and then maybe I find out after the fact?
Mr. Jacobs, could you address the legal question of whether something addressed to a board member in our official capacity is actually private correspondence?
Yes, well, it's not private correspondence. If the mail comes into an agency, no matter who it's directed to, it is the property of the agency itself, just like it would be for a corporation if the item came into a corporation. Now, as a matter of discretion, if the team sees something identified on that envelope that says personal or some other identifying information that makes it clear that it's really not in the normal course of corporate, if you will, activity, but was meant as something else, then they may decide not to follow the usual protocol and send it on, and understand that it was misdirected and it should have been a personal letter. But that doesn't change the fact that legally, if it comes into CalPERS, it is CalPERS's mail, it is CalPERS's property.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah,
I
please.
assume that means then that if we adopted B, wouldn't we be in violation of that legal prescription?
I have to go back and look at B.
Okay. B would have it be sent directly to the person to who it was addressed without being opened. Isn't that what B says?
Well,
that is correct.
It wouldn't be a violation. It would be a choice by the enterprise to handle mail that it owns in a different fashion.
Ms. Taylor.
Thank you. I would recommend our board members take option A, and I work for the State of California Franchise Tax Board, and I can't even imagine having correspondence sent to me as a board member of franchise, because it would happen all the time. And I imagine it happens frequently here, at least frequently enough, that board members get CC'd on correspondence that's not necessarily anything but, can you help me on my medical claim? Or I didn't get my retirement in 90 days. And they look our names up. We're right on the web, and they're hoping that they can get a quicker response. And you're saying that does happen. I can't, and it's the same thing where I work. If somebody's got a tax compliance issue, and I'm sure, Ms. Paquin knows this. I mean, Ms. Yee probably has been contacted numerous times directly for that stuff. We have a process that handles that. So I don't know that it makes sense for us to receive every single piece of mail that's directed to us. So I'm thinking option A is our best option.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Taylor. I think some of the issues at hand, which are really how quickly do we want member issues to be resolved? There might be time-sensitive information or urgent requests in these letters. How accurately do we want them to be resolved? Are we willing to bear the risk that a board member may not open the mail in a timely fashion and get it back to whomever it ought to go to be reviewed? I think there are a number of risks to actually addressing the members' needs and requirements that in option B, that are embedded in option B. Okay, but we have several members who wish to speak. Ms. Brown.
So let me start by saying I respectfully disagree with your opinion, Mr. Jacobs, and so does the postal inspector and the U.S. attorney regarding who that mail belongs to. You're citing a code that refers to us as employees, and we are not employees. We are elected officials, and therefore we have a constitutionally protected rights to that mail. So I'm just going to say I disagree, and we can have another conversation, and we can have another conversation with lawyers over this. But I'd like to know, you say you log it, so how many pieces of mail are we talking about? You say you have logs on option A. You log private correspondence that says it's confidential, and you log correspondence that is not confidential. You have those.
I don't work in the mailroom, so the logging is if it does require the board to respond to, the board unit will log it, and then they'll forward it to the program area to work.
So it might be helpful to have some data around this discussion.
So we did try to grab the data around it. There's approximately 65 to 68,000 pieces of mail that comes in monthly. Unfortunately, the mail data is not broken out that way, where they track every single mail in which area that it goes to. And so only the mail that requires response from the program area or a letter or correspondence is logged. So we don't log every piece of publication. So if you get some information in the mail about a training, that information isn't logged. So the only items that are logged are those that require a response that goes back to the individual. So not every single item is logged. So if someone just writes a letter to ask the board, to support a legislation, right? That's all kept in the binder, but it doesn't require any action necessarily that you have to write back to the member. So those are just kept in the binder, but it's not actually logged into a system. We only log those items to make sure that we actually respond back to the member.
Well, I'd just like to say that if someone is going to personally address a letter to me, that I would like to take the time to read it, and if I need help with the staff to answer it, we have self-addressed stamped envelopes. It'll take 5 seconds to put it back in the envelope and send it back. And I would like to say, for the very first time, I received an unopened piece of mail, and I really appreciate it. It was a lovely card from a local retiree group inviting me to come speak, but it's the very first time I received a piece of mail, only because I addressed this issue. And we need, as board members, I want to hear from my constituents. I want to know what the issues are, and if someone on the staff is not responding, or if they think there's some waste, fraud, or abuse, they're letting me know. I want to know about it. I don't want the staff to intercept that mail, and I'd like it. So I'm going to vote for option B.
Mr. Jacobs, could you address the first part of Ms. Brown's comments about whether you're citing a code or with respect to the mail being owned by CalPERS and not by the individual board member? What are the citations for your?
You know, I don't have those handy.
Okay.
But I'm happy to come back, and if I'm proven wrong, I'm happy to change my opinion, but I believe that to be the case, and I'm pretty confident of it, but I'd be happy to come back with that. I just don't have it on hand.
Okay. All right. Mr. Slayton.
So I think Ms. Brown raises an interesting issue, and I'm trying to compare this to how we handle issues that come to our attention at the SMUD board, where we have 1.5 million customers, 7-member board. Most of those come by email to us rather than through letters in the mail. And so we get the information, but our protocol is to immediately forward that to what our equivalent of the board service unit, where the staff figures out how to address the particular issue. And we hold our CEO accountable for that board unit being responsive. And the first thing they do is get back to the person saying, we got your correspondence and we're working on the issue. And then they work through it and keep us in the loop on what the resolution is. But we don't drive trying to find the solution. That's a staff function to do that. I think the one thing that may address Ms. Brown's issue is in the flow chart where you get, it's not marked confidential. So it goes to the review and log correspondence and the discuss approach to assist and respond to stakeholder. That's a segment where you could send a copy of that electronically to the board member. So the board member knows that it got received and that it's in process, the staff is working on the issue. If it's a staff issue, if it's something that needs to get resolved by staff. But that way, you know that something has come in that was addressed to you, and staff then loops around, and once the resolution is done, you are then copied with the resolution at the end, if I understand at the end of the chart, where it says receive copy board member on the response. So that may be a way to solve this issue of you knowing what's happening, but at the same time, letting the solution be driven by staff rather than by us, trying to be part of that solution process. So that's my suggestion to the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Yeah, thank you. I have mostly gotten emails from members, as Mr. Slayton has, and I almost would rather people sent a letter in here, because then I have a lot of confidence in staff to be able to look at something that comes in that may be addressed to me and say, oh, this is a routine correspondence, it's a question from a member about their status or something, and respond to it and let me know. When I get them by email, it's just additional extra steps that delays a response to them, because I typically cannot give them authoritative response and would rely on staff to do that anyway. I'm also pretty confident in staff's ability to open something and say, oh, no, this really needs to go to David Miller personally because it's a deposed prince and he needs help to get his money out of the bank, and he's really going to want to see that. So, but whatever it is, I think the trick for me is as long as there is some consistent, systematic circle back at the tail end to let me know, on a reasonably frequent basis, whatever that turns out to be, depending on the volume, that, oh, we responded to these things on your behalf that were addressed here, and here's a copy, just to come to me by email on those routine things. But anything that doesn't fit that mold, just get it to me ASAP, and chances are it'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you. So, since this is an information item, I would maybe make a suggestion to the chair that maybe we add some to A, choice A, we add some stopgap where we can have either an email sent to the board member or so you open it, you take care of it, and you CC the board member, however you want to do it. Scan it into the system so that you can directly email it, send the board member a copy to board services, however you guys want to do it. But then we could at least, I don't know if that would be sufficient for Ms. Brown, but at least she would know, okay, this was handled by staff because it is a standard staff question, but it was directed to you, and here's your copy of your letter. And you get it at mainly about the same time they're trying to address it. And one of the reasons I asked that maybe we do that is because in the state of California, we have rules regulating how long our turnaround time is before we violate those rules. And I don't know how long CalPERS is, but every agency has its own, and those rules are very stringent. And if you violate those rules, you can get in a lot of trouble. So, as to cards, personal cards, I've never had one of my personal cards opened. I've received several. I don't get a lot, but yeah, I've received from different folks. I've received cards, so I've never had them open before. All of my stuff, all my training stuff, like ICGN, all that stuff comes already opened, and that's okay. It's just advertisements for training. So, but I think maybe there's a solution to not having to have everything go to the board member. And I got to tell you, I have a mailbox, right? And I have to go down to the mailbox and get it. And granted, it's, 3 houses down, but I don't do it every day. So, and if everyone does that, and you don't get your mail, and then you've got a pile of mail and you don't go through your mail, that could end up being a real problem with response time. So that's my concern.
Yep, thank you. I would wonder, too, if we would need to consider what consequences there would be for a board member who failed to forward a member's request, where a member missed a deadline or didn't get something resolved that otherwise would have been, and whether we would need to amend the governance policy to contemplate that issue. Mr. Rubalcaba.
Yeah, I was trying not to speak on it, but I think I will. No, I share Ms. Taylor's concern. If a member writes to a board member, they're seeking assistance, so we should not get in the way of that. And so I would think like a compromise, the suggestion Ms. Taylor made about notifying, alerting the board services unit once it's been logged, alerting the board member would be sufficient. Because under the option A, at the end, once there is a response, the board member is CC'd and receives a copy. So all we're doing is getting an advance copy. And if it's, they'll determine if it's personal, they'll forward it. So I'm happy with option A with the little minor amendment to set up an alert in the front end as opposed to the end. Thank you.
So then I think, absent any opposition from the committee, that I will direct the team to bring back that revised option that would provide for simultaneous notification of board members that a piece of correspondence has been received, that this is how it's being proposed to be handled, and so that they get simultaneous notification. Ms. Brown.
That's assuming that it's legal. So we'll have that conversation about whether or not you can actually intercept a board member's mail.
So that will also, thank you. That will also, that's also part of the direction that will be brought back, the citations that support the opinion that you've shared, Mr. Jacobs. Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. What is the difference in what we do now in relationship to option A? Because,
that's pretty much what we do now.
Yeah, because I'm saying I get from the board services unit a copy of mail that has come and been opened, and they indicate that we've forwarded to a certain program for a response. Do I have any questions? And 9 out of 10 times I don't have a question. And that's an immediate response to our stakeholders. And so I don't know why we changing that, and if it's confidential, I agree that it should be left to the board member to determine, but on the other hand, if it's routine mail, being more responsive to the stakeholders, I think is important, because if you send it to me, and you say a week here, but sometimes maybe 10 days, and if I'm not at home, it could be 3 weeks, and then the members, well, why isn't he responding to me? But at least in my email, I could, wherever I am, I see the staff is already working on it. And so I think it's working fine. I don't see what the problem is. Okay.
Thank you. I have no further requests. Oops, sorry, I just turned somebody off. I might have turned you off, Jen. I have no further requests on this item. Is the direction clear, and does that seem like something that can be brought back at the next Governance Committee meeting? Yes? Okay, terrific. I don't believe I have any public comment on this one. So that will bring us to agenda item number 9, the board self-evaluation process.
Yes, and on this item, I am going to ask for the able assistance of Ann Simpson.
Thank you very much, Ann Simpson. This item sets out some issues for consideration on the self-evaluation that CalPERS carries out every 2 years. Matt Jacobs has helpfully summarized the different ways in which this could be done, and also summed up the ways it has been done, I think, on the last 3 occasions. Since the agenda item went out, and we've been looking at how to make sure that this process is really valuable for the board, because the goal of this is to ensure that the board is contributing to its full potential, and individual members feel confident and competent about what they're doing. And I think if there's something we've learned over the years in our corporate governance program, it's that governance really affects performance. And the evaluation is an opportunity to look into what's going on at the moment and come up with ideas for improvement. And I think everyone benefits from that. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for the board to think about how it wants to go through the self-evaluation process. Matt Jacobs and I spoke to an organization which CalPERS has been a member of for a very long time, the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD. And I think those of you who'll know this group, it's a widely recognized body, a center of excellence on governance. And one of the services that they offer members, full members like CalPERS, is facilitating evaluation. And the nice thing is that they have a menu of options which range from a very simple process of providing a survey which individual members can complete, through to having an actively involved professional facilitator who would be somebody whose qualifications would include experience working with a large, complex public body like CalPERS, right through to not just having a facilitator who can interview board members and give them feedback on the evaluation process, but through to a third option, which would be include recommendations and ideas for improving governance. So I think our conclusion at the end of this conversation is that there could be a benefit to thinking about how we use our existing membership of the NACD for this process, and see how we can really draw on a wide range of expertise that they've got to offer. I did, when looking back through the files, find that NACD had actually given CalPERS an award for board governance in 2014. And I think that was a reflection that although CalPERS is a very large, complex organization, there are some very high standards of transparency and accountability at work. And the board having a code of conduct, having a commitment to doing regular self-evaluation. CalPERS was really viewed as being a pioneer in its own sector. So with that, I think either one of us would be glad to answer any questions and seek the board's input on next steps on how you'd like to proceed. Thank you.
Ms. Hollinger.
Yeah, I'm in favor of moving forward, and whatever next steps would be necessary, I'd like to lend my support.
So I think part of the question is how to proceed, what type of self-assessment we would like to proceed with. Is that right? So the question is whether we want NACD to perform this service for us, and what form that would take, and are there various maybe you could restate some of the options that NACD offers with respect to the types of self-assessments we could embark on?
Yes, and I'm looking at our councillor here to see if he'd like to add. They have 3 options which are wonderfully named. There's the basic option. This is worthy and useful and costs $20,000. There is the classic option, which is $40,000, and there is the premium option, which is $65,000. And the way that this is worked out is the basic option allows NACD to work with CalPERS to tailor a survey, a questionnaire basically, which each board member would complete. And then, if you like, I think this was your phrase, Matt, they would crunch the numbers. There'd be an independent source for giving feedback to people individually. That's the basic. The second, called the classic option, takes that one step forwards, and it actually looks at aggregating the results and gives some feedback so that you have a much deeper picture of the dynamics across the whole of the board. And then the third option, which is the premium, it is where the results are delivered to the full board, and NACD facilitates up to 2-hour discussion on the results with recommendations for how the board's performance can be enhanced. Based on what they've seen, what they've learned, and also the fact that, you know, CalPERS has always been committed to be a thought leader on governance. So they know that, you know, really that CalPERS wants to be at the forefront of best practice. So with that in mind, in other words, CalPERS is not a beginner. I'm sure it would be a different process for a smaller or simpler organization, or one that was just getting started.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
I would just add that one of the options is also that instead of coming back with feedback to the entire committee or board in an open session, that the consultant would go back to each individual board member on an individual basis and give her or him feedback that that they had obtained from the survey process, and the potential benefit of that being that you don't have the awkwardness and the discomfort of trying to discuss some of these issues in open session. The other thing I would just point out is that there are other, I mean, Ann and I thought that the NACD would be a good place to go for these services, but The governance policy is very open in terms of different ways that the board can choose to do this self-evaluation. You don't have to go with NACD, or it's not going to hurt our feelings too much, but you've got expert third-party facilitator to lead or co-lead with the board president the self-assessment process, feedback from external key stakeholders on board performance, third-party evaluation of the board's performance, peer-to-peer and upward evaluations from the staff. So for some of the board members who have been around for a while and have gone through these processes, you may have your own thoughts and opinions on which have worked, which haven't worked. Maybe none of them have worked. You want to try something new. I just throw that out to kind of open the discussion beyond NACD or any particular type of self-evaluation.
Thank you. David Miller.
I'm really kind of looking forward to this. This is a topic that is kind of near and dear to me. I've been doing organizational assessment stuff for over 20 years based on Baldrige, and as organizations have become more mature, higher performance organizations have kind of been compelled to really look at how well is our leadership system working objectively, including our boards. And so I've seen a lot of these ventures into self-assessment. And so to me, the biggest bugaboo is always, well, how effective was it? Are we better afterward or after a few cycles of refinement and improvement? And how do we know? And so whatever we choose to do, I hope that we'll build in some sort of meaningful, systematic approach to determine what are we getting. Are we really better than we were a year or 2 years ago? And can we attribute some of that to these assessments, particularly self-assessments, absent any kind of outside input?
No, thank you very much, Mr. Miller. That's an extremely important point. And looking back through Matt Jacobs' note, you've had different consultants, 3 different consultants. So probably what the institution is not able to do is harvest what's been learned. You haven't got the continuity. But I think the issue of establishing first, I think, through the process is, okay, what are we good at? Where could we do better? And what are fresh new ideas for making the whole experience of being on the board something to enjoy, something challenging, something that's really going to improve CalPERS performance on behalf of the members. You know, efficiency, not just accountability and transparency, but, you know, getting the job done well and feeling very satisfied that it's being done in the best way that people know how to do. So I agree with you. I think doing an evaluation, you always enter into it with a little trepidation because you don't know what you'll find out or what you'll come to understand. But really, being open and honest as you enter into the process means you've got an opportunity to build out some new ideas, some new thinking. So I think it's always beneficial. But I think your good advice about establishing some objectives or KPIs at the beginning is a very good one. And whoever the board decides as a facilitator, or even if you decide not to use a facilitator, I think that's very sound advice.
Thank you. Excuse me, Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Having been involved in the 2016 effort, I know it can be uncomfortable at times, but I think there's a couple of reasons that I would recommend to the committee to consider the NACD offerings. One is they're involved in the corporate world where we're investing. So it sends a signal that we're willing to subject ourselves to the same kind of introspection that we're asking for our companies that we own to go through as well. So I think there's an extra advantage in using them. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of continuity in this, and you know, that's just unfortunate. We've had 3 different consultants to do this. I think using somebody from the outside is important to do. I think it's valuable to do. What we lose is we don't have the continuity of using the same, every 2 years, using the same organization with the same survey questions, so you start to see the trend lines of whether we're improving or sliding in a certain area. But that being said, we are where we are. I think that it's important to have it be in public. I know that's uncomfortable, and we have shared that discomfort in doing it in a public setting. But the reality is we're a public agency, so we should not be afraid to have the conversation about what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, how could we improve, what should we deal with. And I think that's important to convey that message to all of our stakeholders and the general public, that we are focusing on this and that we're paying attention to this. If it's just results to the individual board member, I don't think it's going to have a very significant impact as an end result. And so I would suggest, given the complexity of the organization and as big as we are, that what was the third one? What was the Cadillac one?
Can you use your microphone, please, Ann?
What was it?
Excuse me. The 3 options are basic, classic, and premium.
Right. And the difference between classic and premium was recommendations from them? Was
Indeed.
That 2 hours?
So the premium option includes NACD's facilitator giving a 2-hour, having a 2-hour feedback session with some ideas and recommendations.
Yeah. I would encourage us
raising our game.
I would encourage us to do that, because then it gives us something on the table to work with. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no, sorry, Ms. Paquin. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also concur. I think that the NACD process is very intriguing, and I think that having recommendations from them following the self-assessment study would be very important. So thank you for bringing this item.
So this is an information item. I've heard 2 sort of votes, not votes, but 2 members of the board speak in favor of the NACD premium process. Is that acceptable to the committee? So then I think that will be the direction, is to proceed along that line. Do we need a motion, Mr. Jacobs, or is direction?
Well, I'm looking at the delegation to the governance committee, and it says that the board governance committee is authorized to conduct and oversee periodic self-assessment of effectiveness, policies governing board conduct, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it would be best.
A motion would be better.
Practice to have
good governance.
Ms. Hollinger.
Exactly.
Okay. I make a motion to pursue the NACD premium package for board self-evaluation.
Thank you. Motion made by Ms. Hollinger, seconded by Ms. Taylor. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to agenda item number 10, summary of committee direction. Mr. Jacobs.
Yes, on item 6, which is the
harassment
process
allegations.
for handling harassment allegations, the direction is to come back with a draft policy similar to or based upon the University of California Regents one that was attached to the agenda item, and explore UC's experience with that policy on an informal basis and report back on that.
I think there was also a question of whether they have special constitutional permission to have a 3-person panel, or if there's some legal rationale for having a 3-person panel.
Okay. On item 7, which is the process of reviewing closed session and other confidential materials, the direction is to investigate the use of CalPERS' field offices as potentially secure places for board members to come and review confidential materials, and also continue to look at whether there are technical or other solutions to the issue.
Yes. Did you have something else, Ms. Hollinger?
Well, no, just.
Yeah, that's the technological solutions, yes.
Okay.
And then on item 8, which was the process for handling mail directed to board members, we are going to come back with an amended option A to reflect that there would be simultaneous notification to the board member of the receipt by the agency of mail directed to her or him, as well as support for the legal principle that an agency may open the mail to that comes in to the agency, but is directed to individual board members.
The only other thing that I heard with respect to the process is whether and maybe this would be, there would be two options, but whether the draft resolution or response to the member would be forwarded to the board member in advance or after the response is given to the member, him or herself. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Juarez?
Yeah, I thought the issue that was raised by Ms. Brown, and she can speak for herself, but I'll raise the issue and see if she agrees, was who owns the mail that's
Yes.
addressed to us?
So he did
That's the
address
question.
That's
Not whether you can give it to me. Who owns it?
That's one of the pieces that Mr. Jacobs was referencing that he will bring back as well. Yep.
Right. And then number 9, the board or the governance committee took a vote that we will pursue, and we will pursue the Cadillac option from the NACD and
Premium, like that.
technical. We will pursue that and report back as to how those negotiations proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you.
With that brings us to agenda item number 11, which is public comment. I've had no requests to speak. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak at this time? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.